and answer them here in the studio. If you have a question, chances are there's other people with the same question. Send them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick.
It's great to have you here again, Dr. John. Of course, we had a few questions come through last week. One was in relation to the Big Bang. And interestingly, last night, Dr. John, a friend of mine, he was online and he bought a star for his girlfriend, literally purchased a star and paid money for it. They named the star after his girlfriend. I thought, wow, that's cool. I said, who'd you buy that through? He goes, I think it's through NASA. Well, I've looked it up online this morning and it doesn't look like there's any official agency that actually sells stars. So I think he might have been had there, but whoever it is, well, they've got an opportunity to make a lot of money because there's literally billions and billions of stars out there. And a question that we had last week was in relation to the Big Bang and all the billions and billions of stars out there. And, of course, the question was a really long question. You've seen the whole question, but the guy was questioning, how could the Big Bang have been real?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and of course it is extraordinary that people can actually believe, looking at the night sky, that the Big Bang was true. And I mean, your friend, he ought to get in touch with Elon Musk, I think, and maybe travel to that star and put a no trespassing sign on it or something like that before anybody else does. But look, we got a lot of great questions last week. We got a couple from Bob, and we think there's a few Bobs out there. So good morning to all the Bobs out there, and keep sending in your questions because they were really great. The ones we got last week, I'm going to deal with both of them this morning. But look, the first, Bob, I'd have to agree with you, Bob, when you say it really is amazing that people can believe in a Big Bang when they see the wonder of the universe around them. And you look up at the night sky and you see all that order, and it really is impossible to believe that it could have resulted from an uncontrolled and undirected explosion. I mean, we've just seen what an uncontrolled and undirected explosion can do in Beirut. It flattens the city. It doesn't cause any order. It causes chaos. Yeah, and that's what you get from undirected and uncontrolled explosions. And when we look up at the night sky, we see what the psalmist expressed in wonderment. He said in Psalm 8, when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars that you've set in their places, what is man that God is mindful of him? And Psalm 102 says something similar. The heavens are the work of your hands. And, I mean, it's very, very obvious that when you look up at the sky, and you're quite right, Bob, how could anybody consider that what we see is an accident? And remember, the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been able to be seen in what was made, so that people don't have any excuse. And we've got even less excuse really in our day, because the ancients could only look up at the night sky with their naked eye and see what they saw, but we've got telescopes and space probes and all the other sort of things that give us a far better view. And, how could, those people would never have suspected when they wrote the Bible the sort of things that we now know. And they just had no idea about them, and they had no idea, any idea that the order would result from an uncontrolled explosion, no matter how long ago it occurred. That really does seem ridiculous, but people can believe it. And there are so many interesting things that would be quite unexpected. I mean, if the order had come from an explosion, you'd expect that the same thing would be happening in all parts of the universe. Yeah. But even when we look up at in our solar system, look at Venus and Mars. They're the closest planets to us, and we still know very little about them. And when it comes to the Big Bang itself, it was, when it was first put forward, it was a bit of a joke. And a guy called Sir Fred Hoyle, who was the Astronomer Royal, he thought it was just ridiculous, and he was an astronomer. And he was the one who referred jokingly to it as the Big Bang. Mm-hmm. So it started off as a bit of a joke, or the name did anyway. But the name has stuck because people haven't got anything better to go on, and it gets God out of the picture, so that's the way they believe it. But when you think about things like Venus and Mars, now they're both very close to us, similar size to Earth, but there's some amazing differences, and we'll talk about that when we come back.
Absolutely. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. Send your questions through to our text line 0408. And we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. He's talking to us this morning about questions that have been coming in. Of course, you can text your question in to our text line 0401 949 949. We've been talking about the Big Bang and some of the planets even closer to us, Dr. John.
Yes, Mick, that's absolutely correct. I just mentioned Venus and Mars because they're the closest planets. But I mean, when you read what the astronomers say about the cosmologists about the Big Bang, they talk with such authority about the Big Bang that you would think they know what they're talking about. But truly, we know so very little. And when you think of Venus and Mars, which are the two closest planets to us, about the same size as Earth, we know very, very little about them. So let alone what the rest of the universe is like. And I mean, with a Big Bang, if any order did come from an explosion, you'd think that everything would be rotating in the same way, anyway, at least. But Venus spins the other way. Earth rotates from east to west, but Venus goes from west to east. And they've only just noticed this amazing... Venus has got an atmosphere of, they believe, mainly carbon dioxide. It's a very, very hot planet. Yep. But there's this enormous cloud, about 4,000 k's in length, that spins around the planet every 4 or 5 days. Nobody has a clue what it's all about. The Japanese have had a probe orbiting Venus for about the last 10 years and still have no idea what this cloud is all about.
Yeah, I've read a story about it, and they say what causes the cloud wall is still unknown and will require further research, and basically they go on and on talking about how they really don't know anything about it.
Yes, that's right. And when you think about Mars, we've sent up those little rovers that have been chugging around, but they wouldn't have examined an area the size of Erin. And I mean, that's not a lot of Mars. Yep. And maybe the next probe is going to, the one we talked about last week, might give a little bit more information, perhaps.
They have found something very interesting there, though, Dr. John. They found lots of red rocks.
Yes, and I'm sure they'll find more of those. But look, I mean, obviously we do know a little bit about Mars, and the new probe will tell us some more. But when you think about other planets in the solar system, Saturn and Jupiter and so on, they've all got a lot of moons, and some of those moons are quite small, but it's known that they're very geologically active, geysers and all sorts of volcanic activity. And if the Big Bang were true, then you would expect that those moons were long dead. All of that activity would have ceased, but it's still going on. Yeah. And there was an article in the news recently about Jupiter's moon Ganymede, which is the biggest moon in the solar system. And really amazing things going on there that people just don't know anything about. Yeah. So really, cosmologists just don't know a great deal about the heavens. Yeah. And
of course you say, it should have run out by now. What people have to understand is it has been proven scientifically that pretty much any battery, anything with energy, it uses its energy. If you have sort of something that's really hot like the sun next to something that's sort of reasonably cool like a little planet spinning around, it will run out of energy, and so things will actually stop because of the cold of space. And, these things are still going on.
That's right. And, of course, they're much further away from the sun than we are. And being small, you would expect that they would have lost all their heat if they were billions of years old. But if they're only a matter of thousands of years old, which the Bible clearly teaches, then it's not surprising that they're still geologically active. So, the Bible is very emphatic that God created the heavens and the earth, and he did it all over 6 days. The Bible tells us that earth was created first, and the sun and the moon and the stars on day 4. And on about 10 different occasions, the Bible talks about how God stretched out the heavens after he created them. And everything that we see is absolutely consistent with what we read in the Bible.
Absolutely. You're on 90. And we have Dr. John in the studio. Yes, he's talking to us about creation, evolution, aliens, dinosaurs, whatever you like. Just send your questions through to 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, we had a question that came in last week, and it said, you mentioned sedimentary rock as an evidence of a worldwide flood. What or how many other evidences are there of basically that worldwide flood? How can he sort of find them in his travels?
Yes, well, look, thank you, Bob, for that question. And it's not the only one we got during the week about sedimentary rocks. So Bob wants to know how he can see other evidences, so I'm going to talk about that. But because we got the other question about sedimentary rock, I thought I'd better do a little bit about that before we get on to the other evidences. And, of course, what we're talking about when we talk about sedimentary rocks is 75% of the Earth's surface. And here we are when we're walking around the Central Coast. What we're walking on under our feet is sedimentary rock, layer upon layer upon layer of it. And we can prove that because if we go down to Terrigal or Avoca and have a look at the cliff face, we can see all those layers of sedimentary rock. Yep. And when we drive down the M1 to Sydney, we can see as we go through the cuttings where those layers have been exposed, just like the layers of a cake. So we know that if we dug down underneath our feet now, we would get to sedimentary rock. Now, everybody agrees that all of those different layers have been put down by water depositing different lots of sediment over time. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, what the world wants to believe is that those layers were put down over millions of years. Yep. Right? Whereas at Creation Ministries, we would believe that those layers were put down during Noah's flood, with tidal washing and all of that sort of thing, depositing sediment. Yep. Now, we've got to remember that Noah's flood actually lasted for a full year. The floodwaters were on the earth for a year. So the tides were going backwards and forwards all of that time, bringing in those layers of sedimentary rock. And we know when we look at them, the first piece of evidence that tells you that the world's view must be wrong is when you look at the interface between the layers, you see that it's a pretty sharp interface. Mm-hmm. Now,
before you go too far, you say the floodwaters are there for a year. But it was only 40 days before they saw the first mountain peak.
No. It was about 7 months before they saw the first mountain peak.
Oh, right. I thought it was like, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights.
Rained for 40 days and 40 nights. All the fountains of the Great Deep were broken up. We believe, as we mentioned in the last couple of weeks, that was how the tectonic plates got all broken up. Uh-huh. Heaps and heaps of volcanic activity. I mean, it was an absolute... amazing event, Noah's flood. I mean, it was more than just a flood. It was just the destruction of the first earth.
So there would have been a lot of sediment.
Oh, yeah, there would have been a lot of sediment, all right. So yeah, that's how... Now, obviously, we can't describe exactly how it happened because we weren't there. Mm. But that's how we believe it would have happened. Mm. And when we look at those layers of sediment, we can see that what we're believing from the Bible actually fits with what we observe. And it doesn't fit with the world's speculation about millions of years between the various layers. Yeah. Because if I give this example, if we were to go and dig down in the dirt beneath us, we'd have a certain amount of soil, and we'd get down to the sedimentary rock, which is lying underneath the soil.
Yep.
Now, that soil has, in our view, accumulated over the last 4,500 years since Noah's flood.
Yep.
Now, if there were millions of years between the layers, you would expect to see that there'd been a bit of soil accumulating in those millions of years before the next layer came on it.
Yep.
But we don't find that. We don't find any soil between the layers. We find this sharp interface, layer upon layer, and that suggests to us that there really was negligible time difference between one layer coming down on top of the other.
Yep.
So we believe that when you actually look at the sedimentary rock layers, that they must have been put down one layer at a time over a relatively short time frame.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that you often see is you see a whole lot of layers bent into an unusual shape.
Yes.
Now, you can't bend rock without breaking it. So the layers had to have been soft sand before they got bent, and they all got bent at the same time. Otherwise, you would see fracturing of one layer and not the others. So when you look at those sedimentary layers with a critical eye, what you see is that it all accords with the biblical story, but it doesn't accord with the world's millions of years between the layers. So something's wrong.
Absolutely. Well, international, and he's been speaking to us this morning about some very interesting stuff, everything from the universe, the Big Bang, and then, of course, to basically looking at sedimentary rock. And Dr. John, the question went on to sort of ask, what other things can he see in his travels to identify that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, look, Bob, there are things that you can even see around here on the Central Coast. And one of the interesting observational things are what we call polystrate tree trunks. Now, what do I mean by that? It's an upright tree that goes through several layers of sediment. And obviously they can't be millions of years layers because the tree trunks would have rotted. So, and you see these a lot in coal fields, and you can see them in exposed parts of sedimentary rock, even here on the Central Coast. But the interesting thing about it is that when you have a look at those tree trunks, you find that although they're upright, they don't seem to have any roots. And that's because they didn't actually grow in that spot. They actually got transported there and got buried along with the sediment. And there's a great example, Bob. You said, what can you see on your travels? Well, some of them you can't see on your travels anymore. I was hoping to see some on my travels earlier this year. I was going to go to Yellowstone National Park in the US, but of course the coronavirus scotched all of that. So
you were scared, you were petrified, weren't you?
I was petrified. Yeah, that's good, Nick. But look, what they have in Yellowstone National Park is what they call the petrified forests. And these are a whole lot of layers, 20 or more of them, of forests buried one on top of each other, and looking for all the world, like as the secular world describes it, how a forest grew and then it got covered in sediment, and then later on another forest grew on top of it and got covered in sediment, and so on, with all of these different layers of forest, one on top of the other. And that was the conventional view. But when you actually have a look at the evidence, you can see that it can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the tree trunks, there they are, mostly upright, but they don't have any roots. They've been sheared off, and it's just the tree trunk that's been buried.
Yep, there's a few sideways ones.
Yeah, there's a few
I'm
sideways ones. and the interesting thing about the sideways ones are they're all orientated in the same direction. Now, you don't find that in a forest. If you see fallen trees in a forest, they're at random directions.
Yes.
But these are all travelling in the same direction.
Yep.
So it looks like they were there waterborne. Now, one of the creationists made a prediction that turned out to be true. He said all of those trees, they haven't grown one on top of the other over millions of years. He said they've actually been transported from the same site, one layer after another, and buried along with sediment.
Yeah.
And he said when we actually have a look and drill into them and have a look at the tree rings, we'll find that they all match.
Yep.
And lo and behold, when that was examined, they did all match.
Wow.
So it was obvious that they were all actually coming from the same place, growing at the same time, and not over thousands or millions of years, one forest being buried on top of the other. So again, the creationist prediction was absolutely true. So I think that really is a terrific example. And Bob wanted to know whether there were other examples. Well, yes, we can also point to, and this is an example of how some of those things might have happened with those trees that got buried in the petrified forest. 40 years ago, there was a volcanic eruption in Washington State in the US. I mean, not that far from Yellowstone National Park, but this was a Mount St. Helens volcano which blew up in 1980, so not all that long ago.
Yep.
Now, as volcanic eruptions go, it wasn't all that big. I mean, nothing like Krakatoa or any of those other famous eruptions in history, or Vesuvius or whatever. But it was big enough. And it blew out the side of a mountain. And it killed quite a few people too. But one of the things that it did was it destroyed the forests that were growing on the mountain. And it actually completely uprooted the trees, sheared them off at their base, and threw them all into a lake, which is called Spirit Lake. And the whole lake, very, very large lake, was covered in floating logs. And they made floating log mats. And interestingly enough, we believe that that's one of the ways in which, after the flood, animals got transported all over the earth, because the flood waters would have been covered in a lot of these floating log mats as well.
Wow.
And it is known that animals move from one place to another on log rafts and vegetation and things like that. So that's just an interesting side effect. But these trees were sheared off at their roots, and they were just logs floating around. Now, over time, a lot of those have become waterlogged, and they've sunk in a vertical direction.
Yep.
And when divers have gone down to the bottom of the lake, what they see is that those logs have planted themselves in the bottom of the lake upright, looking for all the world as if they had grown there, but they haven't.
Wow.
Right? And they've only settled there. They're dead trees, of course, but it looks like they're growing, but they're not. So it's just another example of how some of this sort of stuff that we observe now might have happened in Noah's flood.
Yeah, absolutely. Wowee. Have we got much more this morning, Dr. John?
A little bit. I wanted to mention to Bob another example that I personally had on my travels of seeing how Noah's flood had shaped the topography of the Earth's surface. And it was quite a few years ago. I was in a plane travelling from Adelaide to Sydney. And as the plane took off from Adelaide, you fly over the ranges. Anyway, I'll come back to that in just a moment.
All right, you're on 94.9 this morning. At full, you're on 94.9. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And I've got to say, I love that last little bit, Dr. John. It makes sense. I mean, I was looking at the photos as you were speaking about Yellowstone National Park and looking at some of these logs that are sitting upright, and they're actually up on mountains. They're not down in the valleys, but they're petrified. Basically big logs that don't have any roots. And so, yes, we know that, in water, as a log gets waterlogged, it falls down one way. I'd never seen that before, and wow, that's an awesome evidence of the flood.
It is, and Bob wanted to know things that he could see on his travels, and of course he's not likely to be able to travel to Yellowstone National Park in the near future. But I observed this from a plane travelling from Adelaide to Sydney. As you leave Adelaide and go over the ranges, and you look down, and you can see how they've obviously been shaped by water runoff. You know, all the valleys and ravines that you see as you travel by air, it's obvious that it's water runoff, as we believe in Noah's flood, that's caused it. You could probably see it here on the Central Coast too, if you're up in the air. But look, thanks for your question, Bob. It was a great question, and it's given us quite a bit to talk about this morning. But I want to remind everybody to really listen in next week, because I'm going to talk a bit about evolution and an example that's happened in the last couple of weeks about an apology put out by the Bronx Zoo in New York, because they actually exhibited a man as an animal in a cage.
Wow.
Now, that is really something, and it's the Black Lives Matter protests that have brought about this apology from the Bronx Zoo. So be listening next week. I'm going to talk about that.
That sounds exciting. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Another awesome week. Of course, Dr. John, you guys have creation.com, a website with a lot of information on it. There's literally thousands of pages, and people can go there and get answers to pretty much any question they can come up with, or of course they can send the questions through to you, and or it comes through to me. I send them on to you, and all you have to do is send them through to our text line. We have a text line which means SMS only. You can't leave voice messages on there, so text 0401 949 949. That's 0401 949 949. Thank you for another awesome week, Dr. John.
Good, Mick, and we'll see you again next week.